Hello there, sword friends. Today I'm going to tell you about this sword here. It is a blade from Al-Ayuubi, and I don't really know much about the company. I bought this secondhand from sword friend Matt, and I will link Al-Ayuubi in the description down below if you're interested in getting one. Some disclaimers to know up front. One, this is a used blade that I bought secondhand. So the blade was sharpened. It had some repairs done to the grip, which had the pommel had come off and it was re-glued. It was sharpened, and I think those are the main things, as well as the pitch area between the crossguard and the blade has been replaced with some sort of JB weld, which apparently was better than what was there before. But this is got some customizations, if you will, or some improvements or some modifications that make it somewhat different from what was originally sent. It was $350 when it was originally sent, or thereabouts, and I suppose the most important thing, this is like a fantasy piece, so I don't know that any kind of practical martial arts or swordsmanship is really applicable to it, but it is important to know it. Whatever style of sword this has, I certainly don't study it, and I don't like it. That's maybe the main important thing that you should take away from these disclaimers, that going into this review, I did not like this sword. I didn't want to do this review. Sword friend Matt sold this to me for a song some time ago, and I've kept it around because it was cable and it was somewhat interesting, and I used it in a couple other videos as an example of bad, but I didn't want to do the review, but I've been coerced into thinking that it might be interesting. So I went into it, but you should know my attitude is somewhat pissy about it. So with that context in mind, I will go into the actual review as I do. Review the build quality, the bits and bob, features, and all that kind of stuff. Then I go into the use, and eventually I will push this sword to failure, and you'll get to see that. So anyway, on with the show. The first bit, I start with the pommel, which incidentally is separated now, and this pommel is sharp and jagged, and you kind of could grab it, but the antler around it is not smooth in such a way that you could really grab onto it with another hand. It's somewhat jagged, but at the same time somewhat usable, so you could get a second hand on it, and it has certainly an interesting look to it. It's brass and has some detailing that is etched in, at least from what I can tell, around the side. There's also some casting lines on the inside that show, again, for $350, this isn't a huge amount of money, but it's also not an inexpensive amount, and I would expect that some of these seams were tidied up a little bit better than they were. So just some quick time with a file on brass would have removed some of the seams, and I think that would have made it look a little better. The etching and whatnot is a nice detail, just unfortunate to see the inner lining, the seam on the inner lining. The pommel is met with some antler, and the transition here is reasonably good. Now, the antler is still a bit sharp. Again, I don't like swords that hurt me, and that's what this pommel does in a few different ways. And so I can't necessarily say that I like it, but it does transition to the antler reasonably well. There's some flat spaces along here that make it not perfect, but for a sword with this kind of decoration in this price point, I don't necessarily think that the transition itself is bad. What I do think is bad is that it was repaired when I got it. Now, the repair supposedly had been glued along here, and as I look at it on the grip, basically it just was glued on. There was no mechanical connection keeping this pommel to this handle, and that is a failure. That's not how pommels should be constructed. There should be some sort of mechanical connection if it's anything other than a wall hanger. Now, given this is a sharpened Cable Damascus Blade, I believe it has the intent of usage, but just a glued half-inch recess in the pommel isn't sufficient for a mechanical connection or a connection to a pommel in something that's going to take a lot of vibration. So it burst on Matt, and on like the first water bottle that I cut a pool noodle. It did that fine. When I cut a water bottle, it didn't cut through the water bottle, and it just burst the glue that was the fix that sword friend Matt had put on it apart, and the pommel came off. So aesthetically, not my cup of tea. Functionally, it has some things between sharp edges here, seams in here, pointy bits here, but the real cincher is that it just fell off in usage. So not my favorite pommel. We move up to the grip right here. Defining the grip, it is from the antler area near the pommel all the way up into the crossguard area with the larger brass fitting that's there, and including the horn bit in between. And honestly, I couldn't find a comfortable spot to grip this sword in. Towards the antler area, it's more bulbous, and the antler is somewhat jagged and not particularly delicate on my sensitive nubbins. And up towards the crossguard area, if I choke up on it, that spine pokes into my hand, and it's not particularly fun either. I didn't find really a comfortable spot. There's no ergonomic area or kind of spot your hand feels well rested, that you feel like you have good purchase and good indexing. It's bulbous and a missed opportunity in terms of handle and shape. There's also some sharp bits on here, apart from the antler or the little spine on the crossguard area. The pins that run through the horn area are sharp, and now you can scratch some fingernail off with them. I didn't find that they cut me or anything while I was using the sword, but it's poor finish quality and a missed opportunity here. I did feel them in some of the harder strikes as well on my hand. The brass washers as well rise up, and I can feel those. So, overall, the handle itself is handsome. If I look at it, I like that it's made of horn. I like that it has some different finish qualities in it. And while it has an overall look that I might not be a fan of, I can certainly say that it's a handsome look. The horn on the grip section was as well really quite durable. To break it apart, I had to be rather aggressive with a hammer on a concrete floor to smash it apart. The horn was pretty durable, and it was one of the few hilt components that really lasted the duration of my testing. Inside that hilt construction, inside underneath the horn, is 2 brass pins that run through a metal sleeve, which the tang is slotted into. The tang, or what's left of it, is cut in various sections and then filled with some sort of epoxy resin, nearest I can tell, pressed into that sleeve. Then that sleeve is set in with inside the handle. I'm guessing, I don't really know how they're constructed, but the 2 brass pins did make a mechanical connection. Worth noting here, though, that as you can see in the tang, a very small section was holding it together. One of the slots, I think, may have been missed, and it created a 1/4 inch by an 1/8 inch section that was basically holding the tang together at a critical spot. And the tang isn't particularly large, rested under that grip. Anyway, moving up from the grip area, we can talk about the crossguard. The crossguard is, or was, the embodiment of bad to me, in that it didn't offer a huge amount of hand protection, less so after I tested it, and it had sharp bits that jammed into my hand, which didn't allow me to choke up on the grip and would pain me if I tried to do so. After a few swings, I noticed that the pitch area or JB weld that Swordford Matt had replaced popped out, and that exposed basically some resin, some stuff that was holding the handle in. I threw this at a tree, and again, in the abusive test, one of the quillins pieces broke off on the back, and that's where I saw that this is basically just a cast shell filled with some sort of epoxy resin. The quillin broke off. I could see the epoxy resin inside, and the crossguard is made out of relatively thin and somewhat, the cross sections here look like it's a pretty high or large grain structure. It doesn't seem to be particularly stable. If you were using it to defend blows, or what quillions should be used for, it looks like they would pop off and break pretty easily because they're thin brass filled with resin. On subsequent throws or strikes, the handle pretty much just came apart, and I could make out little bits like this. So the crossguard, it was handsome in a way. It had some of the same detailing and etching on it at one point, and maybe it has that fantasy aspect or look that you might have liked at one point, but I would argue that the sharp bits on the back are bad and they hurt your hand, and the fact that they are a shell filled with resin is stupid. It's just not an appropriate way to build a sword. So anyway, that's the crossguard there. The pitch coming out wasn't necessarily such a big deal, or the JB weld and whatever it was filled with before. It's it'd be nice if it was met up nicely with the blade, and whatever Swordford Matt had encountered, it was better than it was, or filled with pitch or something. In this case, I'm not really too concerned about it given the price point. At the same time, though, the handle seems really poorly constructed. It doesn't index well. It's more bulbous and round. It has sharp bits on it that point at you in almost every aspect of the hilt, and it seemed poorly constructed and fell apart. Anyway, I will talk about one piece of the sword that I actually like, and that is the scabbard. So it does have some somewhat cheap fittings on it, but again, sword in this price point, these don't come, well, they do move around a little bit, but at the same time, they are reasonably fit, and there aren't some giant transitions. They're actually pretty well fit for, again, a sword in the price point. The lacquer work is not bad. It's relatively smooth. The scabbard is shapely. It doesn't have a lot of taper to it, but it's pleasant looking. The rings aren't cheap washer rings. I've seen swords at $350 in this price point that basically come with keychain rings. And while I can move some of them around and the metal is relatively thin, it doesn't make huge transitions. And I think, again, this is not bad, given that it came with a Cable Damascus Blade and a scabbard and all of that. It's lacquered. The paint scheme is nice. It's got white, which is hard not to show imperfections on, so they speckled it with gold and black throughout, and it does a good job of showing or hiding any kind of imperfections in the lacquer. But overall, it's pretty smooth and pretty well done, and it fit the sword reasonably well, and I happen to like it. The chape area down here doesn't have any large ledges that catch on anything apart from the obvious one. This incidentally bends pretty easy, and I bet I could break it off if I wanted to. Yeah, there it goes. So it's come off. So it's not on there particularly solid, but that may actually be an improvement. Now it's even less prone to catch on things. But thin metal, I don't mind the scabbard though. It did the job for what it was supposed to do, and I like the lacquer work. I like the writing. It's actually a reasonably handsome scabbard for the money. Okay, now I will talk about the blade, or what is left of it. So this was a Cable Damascus blade, and it really had kind of a pleasant pattern to it. It had a kind of a snakeskin look along the surface, and supposedly these are heated and then kind of water quenched along the edge. I got all sorts of readings with my HRC files. Some spots seem to be harder than 60, and some spots seem to be softer than 40, and it wasn't just consistent along the edge. The spine universally was very, very soft, but along the edge it kind of was pretty random. Anyway, so in looking at it, it's been sharpened. It has an etch that shows the Cable Damascus pattern. It has kind of an odd shape to it. It doesn't have the same refinement of shape as some of the other pieces from Al-Ayuubi, at least from what I can tell. It's a little bit more crude in terms of its construction, but overall handsome. Has a nice Cable Damascus piece. I'm not holding the edge against Al-Ayuubi, and it has some pretty simple beveling here. There's not a great transition down to the edge. It has a secondary bevel that meets the edge, and anyway, just a simple shape, but overall it was reasonably pleasant and handsome looking. I didn't mind the look. The cable steel was, if nothing else, relatively interesting. When it came to cutting though, initially I brought the sword out to do some cutting, and my first attempt was at a pool noodle, and I found that it actually cut the pool noodle reasonably well. It doesn't have a particularly sharp edge, so I found that to be surprising. And in the back of my mind, I know I was a bit of a sourpuss at doing this review. I thought to myself, well, maybe there's something to the sword here. It cut a pool noodle well. It didn't turn in my hand. I'm cutting a pool noodle. It was different for me to move around, and I thought maybe I just need to get over myself and give the sword a chance. So after the pool noodle, I brought it out another day, and I cut a water bottle, and the pommel basically popped off. It didn't really cut the water bottle particularly well. Odd that it cut the pool noodle reasonably well, but didn't cut the water bottle particularly well. From there, I tried some more abusive things, and so I would cut into a log, and it cut deeply into the log, and nothing really was particularly broke or damaged from there. The sword seemed to be holding together, minus the pommel thing. But eventually the sword did take a bend in one of the bad cuts, and I struck it on the side of the sword, and I would notice that the blade would basically take a bend pretty easily. Striking on the side, the flat, I could bend it to and from pretty easily, and I could set it back, and it was pretty soft. Just some light taps would set it back, some light taps on the side would give it a reasonable bend. From there, it cut logs reasonably well. I can't tell necessarily if it was bending backwards a little bit. It might have been doing that. I didn't really kind of double check myself in that way, but it may have been taking a deeper bend or curving more deeply and striking into the logs. But it didn't always take a set if my angle alignment wasn't so bad. And throwing it at a tree, as I noted earlier, it would bend a little bit. Some pieces would loosen up, but most importantly, one of the quillions broke off. That exposed that they were basically a shell filled with some sort of epoxy resin, and that doesn't seem like an effective way to break or to make a quillion. In fact, I've never had a quillion break on throwing it at a tree before, so that was a new experience for me. Subsequent strikes caused the pitch to come off. Eventually, throwing and striking at things caused the handle to basically explode altogether. I continued to strike. I struck it on a brass fitting. First I struck it on the croquet stick of doom, saw the damage, moved to a brass fitting, and it kind of held up on all of those types of things. It didn't take a significant amount of damage, but the secondary bevel here is a pretty obtuse edge, so it's no terrible surprise. It did deform pretty quickly on the croquet stick of doom, though. Moving back to the croquet stick of doom, subsequent strikes would basically cause little bits to roll, some chips to come out, and overall it would pretty much deform. Now, in using this, I noticed that the handle pretty much came apart, and I thought, well, that's pretty much done. It hurts to move at this point. The handle is pretty small, and a lot of vibration is hitting my hand, and I was going to stop. And later I noticed that the handle basically came apart, and that's when I pulled it apart, and I saw the tang of the blade, or at least some remnants of the tang of the blade. And I see these little cuts in the tang that reduce the size of the tang and are meant likely to fill with glue so that it holds together. But there's basically something that's about a quarter inch wide and deep that is holding the entire sword together, or maybe less. And this little nubby tang spot broke, and that's what eventually I was able to pull apart from the grip. And this is one of the things that made me honestly mad. This is a Cable Damascus blade of reasonable thickness, made to be used, and in the base of the tang there's this little nubby part. It's cut and failure points are built into the tang. Further, there's this very small piece that's really at a critical point, absorbing a lot of force, that's made to hold it together. That's a quarter inch by a quarter inch or less. It seems incompetent, frankly, and it seems dangerous, and it seems like something that shouldn't have left the factory floor. This is not an acceptable way to sell a functional sword. If that's what these were intended to do, perhaps it was just meant as a wall hanger, which I would wonder why it's tempered and sharpened and all of that kind of stuff, if that's the case. But if this is a functional sword, this is not an acceptable thing to sell to people. So that actually that made me a little frustrated. I was optimistic at first. I thought, well, it cut a pool noodle, and then kind of quickly brought to reality as this thing fell apart in my hands. So I did strike it on the croquet stick of doom, though, several times. I did strike it on the spine several times, and the blade didn't break. So after doing those tests, I thought, well, at least the blade held up. If it weren't for incompetence in manufacture on the hilt and the tang assembly, maybe there's something to the blade. But on closer inspection, I did see that there are some very significant cracks in the blade. And that struck me as odd. I thought, well, it's very strange for a crack to be that deep and for the blade to take as much punishment as it did and not break. I thought it was pretty close to breaking. So I went out another day, put a glove on, wrapped the blade in a towel so I could strike along the spine. And it took actually a reasonable amount of effort to break the sword apart. It eventually did break. It deformed quite a bit, but it took a lot of energy to break the sword in half. So kind of takeaway for me is that this cable steel and the tempering that they're doing is a reasonably effective way to make a sword, in that the edge was held up reasonably well. It was soft, but it could be bent back and used as a weapon. It's not the best steel. I'm not going to argue that's the case, but this cable did really hold things together, particularly where it was soft. Now, where the edge was harder and where there were some spots that were presumably of a higher HRC, it cracked, and the cable didn't really seem to offer much in the way of failure protection. But as it moved back into the spine, this blade, for being a soft blade, was very hard to break. It took a lot of energy to split these cracks apart and pull this blade apart. And the cross section, it looks like it's coarse and rough, but I don't really know what to make of it, honestly. It doesn't look great, and so the cable may offer some benefits as a material to use when done even poorly. There seemed to be some resilience in here that the blade wasn't really deserving of. Anyway. That was the experience of cutting. It did make it all the way to the croquet stick of doom and then some. I brought it out and eventually broke it, and it does make me interested in what Cable is capable of doing. At the same time, though, Al-Ayuubi constructed this blade poorly. This is one of the more expensive and, frankly, one of the more complicated offerings. I have another one that I also bought from Sword Friend Matt in the package, and it seems better constructed and maybe made of a material that is less likely to explode and hurt you. All right, sword friends, that is the meat and potatoes of the review. Hopefully it's been helpful and given you some idea of if it's worth your money or not. You can't buy one exactly like this from Al-Ayuubi. I think it's a one-of-a-kind type model, but if they sell a Cable Damascus something in the future, hopefully you know if your dollar is well spent on it. It's time for me to answer that question myself, though, and whether I think about this as a $350 new sword or a $100 sword secondhand with some defects. Either way, it's unequivocally a no for me. This had way too many problems and frankly seems incompetently made. If I start at the pommel, well, it didn't have a mechanical connection. It popped off on Sword Friend Matt prior to selling it to me. It popped off on the first water bottle I cut here. That's not the proper way to make a sword. Apart from any aesthetic issues that I have, that alone is a disqualifier. If I move up to the grip, well, it's not ergonomic and has some sharp bits on it. Those are quick work with a file and not necessarily a big deal, but underneath that grip is, again, incompetent construction. There's a very small tang with some slots in it and a sleeve of some kind and a built-in failure point that is dangerous, frankly. built in the tang. There's something that was about 1/8 of an inch by 1/4 inch wide, holding it together at a very sensitive spot on a sword. And I can't fathom why something like that would leave the shop. It's very poor construction, to say the least. It's difficult for me to think of something worse. Shy of like making the sword explode on impact and have the shards shoot directly into my eyeballs, I don't know what would be a dumber thing to do in making a sword. Anyway, if I move up to the hilt, or the rest of the hilt rather, there's the crossguard with the jagged bits that poke into me, and then the hollow crossguard filled with resin, which doesn't do the job effectively of any kind of hand protection or a crossguard. Then the blade, it took bends relatively easily, but the blade itself was not necessarily, if I subtract the tang and all the stuff, all the stuff hilt and below, tang included, well, there were some interesting bits. Well, it was a little hodgepodge in terms of the heat treatment. It did cut a pool noodle. It lost its edge, incidentally, which I didn't mention necessarily while I was cutting, but it did lose that edge, even the obtuse one. It had some bite to it when I was cutting pool noodles. That was lost pretty quickly when I went to go cut logs and stuff like that. But you could take a set, you could bend it back reasonably easily, and it held its shape as a weapon. And when I was cutting into some abusive things, even though it dulled, it could be sharpened out and conceivably used as a sword. And it had some interesting textures to it, and it lasted for quite a while in some very abusive stuff. So even though it was bendy, it didn't bend so much that it couldn't function as a weapon. And when it failed, I didn't even notice the cracks necessarily. And even with cracks, it took quite a while to fail, repeatedly beating it into the croquet stick of doom. Some of the softer spine and harder edge seemed to work well in its favor in terms of durability here, as well as the material of the cable. It had some odd patterns and ways to hold together. So that much at least was interesting. I'm grateful for the experience, but a good sword it was not. And for $350 or $100, I can't recommend it. It's embarrassingly bad. The failure point, particularly built into the tang, is I think one of the first things that's made me angry as a reviewer. I'm angry at this sword. I mentioned that my bias was I didn't like the sword at the start. I opened my mind a little bit when I was cutting a pool noodle and was surprised. Finding this built-in failure point is almost inexcusable, and unequivocally it would be a no for me. But incidentally, let me know if I'm being an asshole here. I know that this is probably the most negative review that I've ever made, and obviously I think I've articulated why those are. There's a lot of issues with this sword being a $350 product made from a cable type Damascus steel. It has some points in it that I think are accurate, but maybe I'm being unusually harsh. As I noted, there was some bias going in. If that's the case, call me out in the comment section. I'd be happy to rethink my argument, but again, there's a lot going on with this sword that is bad, and I don't think is necessarily excusable. If I separate the aesthetics, there's still just build quality stuff that prevents it from functioning well as a sword, and frankly is dangerous to the user. So that's why I would say no, 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 and no. So that's all I got, though. Hopefully it's been a helpful review. As always, cheers, and thanks for watching.